Good evening and welcome to this evening's session of Rev Up Your Resume. We're on session two, which is about style and details. My name is Heather Rickrell and I serve as the campus counselor, campus career counselor, and the assistant director of career services. So today we're going to cover two things, but they encompass a lot. First, basic do's and don'ts of writing a resume. And then, second, writing strong duty statements or those bulleted statements that you often see on resumes. So, we'll start with the do's and don'ts of resume writing, and we'll go with the do nots. So, things we should avoid. You definitely want to avoid using a template. So, what I mean by that is if you were to open up Word and you were to go into new, like you see here, and then type in resumes and cover letters and then search, you'll find all these templates that come up. These are a very bad idea. And there are a number of reasons why that is the case. The first thing is that a lot of people use templates, and so the look of them is very common. Employers can figure that out right away that you've used a template. So it looks a lot like we see this one a lot. We see that one a lot in our office. A couple of other things that are problematic. You can't control all of the white space and you can't overcome the formatting, which can be problematic if you have some sort of an anomaly or you're trying to make everything fit in one line. It just can get very, very frustrating. Another thing that can be problematic is there are these things called applicant tracking systems, also known as ATS, and those are the robots that read resumes before the human gets them. And so they sort of score resumes before, let's say, the hiring manager gets to see them. And the reason that they're problematic for templates is there's actually a couple of them. One, there might be pieces of digital code that the ATS can't translate, so it could kick your resume out, or it could put just weird things in there, weird symbols and stuff. You don't want that to look like it was your mistake. The other one of the other things is that resumes can't read columns. They tend to read everything from left to right that's on the same line. So even though you might have things in columns, the applicant tracking system will read the resume from left to right. So everything will come through kind of mumble jumble. It can't read graphics, and it also can't read anything in the header or the footer. So here, this is a name in the header footer, name in the header footer. Here's a column. This is a graphic. These are graphics. That's a graphic. You just so it doesn't read those. So those are all reasons that templates are tough. If you send a resume in for review to career services and it comes in on a template, we will ask you to open a Word document and start typing, and start over before we'll review that. Simply because they are so hard to manipulate. Other things to avoid on your resume: avoid using font colors other than black. Don't use fancy or hard to read fonts. Don't change fonts in your resume. Don't use italics for any reason other than scientific names and proper citation of publications. Don't write in full sentences or blocks of text. You don't need to use periods at the end of any bulleted duty statements because you're not writing in full sentences or blocks of text. You also don't need I or my because you're not writing in full sentences. So the first three, actually the first four of the bullets on the screen really have to do with the readability of the resume. So you want that resume to be, really sharp and clean, no matter how small a person's screen is, no matter the quality of a printer or a copier or a scanner. Those things just all help the resume be very readable. Other things that you'll want to avoid: don't misuse abbreviations or acronyms. And one example of this would be, let's say you go to school at University of Wisconsin Superior. You don't want to write UWS out on the resume until you've first written University of Wisconsin Superior and then put UWS in parentheses afterwards. Then you can go ahead and use UWS later in the resume. You also don't want to embellish your experience or include information that isn't accurate. So one thing that becomes a problem is if you get caught, lying or putting incorrect information on the resume, company can rescind their offer to you, or they could terminate your employment. That's a pretty strong case precedent there, one that's not ever really won in the court of law. So be careful of that. Try not to repeat information that's found in other categories on your resume. I know sometimes students put things in two locations, and we can help you sort that out, but in general, you want to avoid that. You really don't need to list your high school diploma and experience unless you really need to showcase your skills or experience. A lot of students have maybe managerial experience in retail or fast food, or maybe in recreation or something like that. Those are the sorts of things that I maybe would encourage you to pull forward. But in general, you don't list your high school diploma. It is simply a requirement and an expectation to get into college. It's kind of one of those commonly known things. The last thing you want to avoid, it's listed on this slide, is putting general skills in something called a skills category or a specialized skills category. Um, the problem with putting general skills, foundational skills, really great skills like problem solving, technology, those sorts of things in a skills category is that it doesn't have any context to it. And so the employer doesn't really know, how did they gain this skill? How did they hone it? How did they put it to work? It's just sort of there. It's also one of those things where kind of anybody could say it, but what they're really looking for is for you to prove it. Also, since these are general foundational skills, they're not technically specialized. Specialized skills are things like, for instance, if I'm a chemist, maybe I know titration techniques. Maybe I know certain safety protocols. Um, what would be another thing that a chemist might know? I probably lots of different mixtures, and um, maybe there's some certain programming or technology they might know. So those are the very specialized things. On the computer science side, if you know Python, C++, Java, those sorts of things, those are specialized skills. So next, well, actually, so to just further illustrate the skills thing, oftentimes I'll see students list skills and then they'll list things like listening skills, basic computer skills, communication skills, interpersonal skills. All great things to have, but don't do this on a resume. What you need to do is write these skills into duty statements so that they have context. And we will talk about that in a little bit here. These are things I want you to do. So do these things. They're best practices for resume writing. Your education category comes first in most cases. Some of you will be career changes, or maybe you had a career in the military and you might want to put a summary of qualifications or something like that first. But again, that's typically for career changers or people who've had a career and aren't just fresh out of high school. You want to pay attention to your style and look. It's got to be readable, consistent, and eye catching, which is why a lot of the don'ts that you saw before are there. You definitely want to make sure that you're using proper tense. So use current tense for work that you're still doing, and past tense for work that is in the past. Um, a couple of other things. You want to make sure that you're not writing your bullets and duty statements all starting with something like responsible for, or using the ing form. So don't say, filing, managing. Use current tense and past tense. You also want to use reverse chronological order, which means that your most recent activity is listed first and then followed by the rest. And the last bullet there, when you're writing out your experiences, put your title first, then the company name, then the city and state, and then the dates. That is the most easily readable for employers. So now we'll talk a little bit about writing bulleted duty statements. And I just want to reiterate that what you write in these statements is really critical because it's where the employer gets context, they can start to see where you've developed your skills and experience, how you've used your knowledge, and they can really get a picture of whether or not you could be good at the opportunity that they have open. So, some things about writing strong duty statements. Because resumes, by definition, are summaries, you might remember that from last week, there's really no need for full sentences or periods that follows along with it or blocks of text. And in fact, employers don't want to read that. So those statements convey what you did at the location, what skills you might have used or developed, and they relay any achievements. They must have the keywords and use the language of the field to which you're applying. So for instance, if I look at your resume and specifically at your duty statements, I should be able to tell what field you're trying to go into because you're going to use the language of that field. You should quantify as often as possible. So one example would be increased followers on Facebook by 23% in the first month of a social media campaign. That would be a good quantifier. And we've already mentioned this, but you want to write your core skills, those foundational general skills, into your bulleted duty statements. So here are some examples that you can look at. The first one, the student mentioned technology and problem solving. So they set up the technology and lighting, and they did troubleshooting with presenters. They talked in the second bullet about how they actually use their written and verbal communication skills. In the third bullet, they're talking about how they use information to write reports. And then in the last one, they're getting at that global and intercultural competency. So working with diverse clients um, and understanding identity. So those are ways to write out those statements that get at those general skills. And I've already said this a couple different times, but I'll keep saying it. Writing strong duty statements is really the key, and it's so crucial to giving your content the context that it really needs. Again, this is how you get noticed by the employer or the recruiter. And this is really where we start to see those decisions being made about whether to interview you or not. And that's the whole goal of the resume, right? To get to the interview. So we want to make sure that those duty statements are right on. And that context is really aided by beginning each duty statement with a strong action verb. And there are some additional resources down here that you can look at. These are both on the UWS website. There's a one document about writing those bulleted duty statements, and then there's another document about action verbs that you can use to begin each duty statement. So here's an example of a well-written duty statement with really strong verbs and quantifiers. And this is a former UWS student. Now this student did come through the Air Force, so you can see that here. Previously in the resume, United States Air Force is written out with USAF in parentheses after it. So you can see there's some military experience here. And there's some farm owner operator experience here. A couple things I want to point out, especially in this bottom piece, which I think is a little bit easier for people to understand. There are quantifiers here. So 2,900 acres of farmland and 175 cow-calf pairs. So the quantifiers are important. This is a sizable operation. This is not a hobby farm. And you can see the scope of what this person did in this farming operation. They packed a lot into these 5 bullet points. Okay. So not only do we have the quantifiers here, these are very formulaic in the way that they're put together. And you can actually see it up top too. But again, this bottom part is a little easier to understand. So secured operating capital and equipment, 4. So 2 is the 4 part. Operate those acres of farmland. They did this in order to accomplish this in the last part of the statement. Manage these many pairs of cattle for what reason? Beef production. And it continues into the last 2 here. The last thing I want to point out is that I can tell what discipline or what area, what sector the student wants to go in if I look at things like operating capital, financial documents, acquire loans, track expenses and income. You have production here. You have maximize yield and minimize input costs. So to me, this person is in the broad field of business and potentially looking in the field of agricultural business. Um, that agricultural business is a little bit hard to tell, but they do have it framed that way. So I should be able to tell by looking at the language you use in your duty statements sort of what you're going for. And if there's not enough of that lingo in there, then we have to work to get it in. So if you feel like you're ready to work on your resume, a great place to start or to keep moving is with the resume formatting suggestions document on the Career Services website. You can find it on the resumes and letters page, but it's a 3-pager, so I know that's kind of long, but you literally can start from the top and it'll work you through the do's and don'ts, and then it works you through the categories, gives you some ideas, shows you some formatting, and then it keeps moving on. So it is a really helpful document. A lot of students mention that it's really helpful and gives them some great ideas. So what's next for next week? The last session in the Rev Up Your Resume session will cover resume review. Some major things that we look for when looking at resumes so that you can get better at looking at your resume. So picking up things that have to do with consistency, things that have to do with readability, how to make the resume more readable, and making sure that you have enough context around your content. So that's what we'll be doing next week. Thanks so much for being here today, and we will see you next week.